Please welcome to the stage the founder of Black Hat, Jeff Moss.
I don't know why I'm drawn to like the edge of the stage, but I just always feel like I have to get right up in your face. It'd be weird if I was way. Doesn't this feel weird? Good morning, Black Hat. Welcome to day 2. Thank you for showing up for our day 2 keynote. See, this feels much better. Hey, thanks for coming back. I hope you had a good night last night. Did any of you go to the reception in the business hall last night? Come on. Anybody? Some people. How many people went off property and actually had a Vegas experience? Yeah. I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why we're in Vegas. When we started Black Hat, there's not many 24-hour cities, or there weren't back then, and there weren't many things for people to do after hours except in Vegas. And it's only gotten better, I think, with food quality and things to do, shows, the Sphere, whatever. It's really crazy how the city has grown up from kind of nothing in the middle of the desert. Anyway, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the themes I brought up yesterday around the importance of people in your organization, or just people in general in technology. And yesterday afternoon's keynote, Ron Diebert from Citizen Lab, an academic civil society perspective on trying to figure out what nation states, what organized crime is up to, their botnets, who they're targeting, spyware organizers, NSO group, these kinds of evidence-based, deeply technical white papers that they release, and how it influences governments around the world, how it exposes governments around the world and some of their human rights violations. And I think at the heart of that is people trying to figure out what the technology is being used for, who's building it, how it's being applied, and how it impacts society. So what we do doesn't happen in just a vacuum. It has political, it has social impacts. And in the early days, reporters, we try to figure this out. So we would be contacted by reporters from all different organizations, and they'd be fact-checking an article, or they'd be talking about new outbreak, and you'd quickly try to figure out who is worth talking to, who can you trust? Because sometimes you have to reveal a lot to a reporter for them to understand the context, to understand your perspective. And a lot of times, I would reveal so much, afterward I would think, they could make me look like a genius, or they could make me look like an idiot. It all depends on how they want to stitch what I said together. And so there was a list that a lot of us kept of the good reporters, and then we had the list of the bad reporters that you did not want to talk to. You couldn't trust them. Nicole, our keynote, was one of the good reporters. And, Lorenzo, Joseph Men, Ellen Nakashima, right? There's some that are just, you don't worry when you talk to them. And what they're trying to do, I think, is figure out where what we're doing fits in. And Nicole tried to do this, or did this, I should say, successfully with her book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And has anybody here read that book? Yeah. It was a little controversial in some of the edges of InfoSec because she was shining a light sort of on the exploit market, sort of in the exploit developers area. And those people don't write books, and they don't really explain how it all works. And so if she got one little detail incorrect, all this pushback, though, she didn't get this minor thing perfect. It's like, well, you could write a book too and explain it. But they wouldn't, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is outsiders sometimes have to come into our spaces to try to make sense of what we're doing, because sometimes we're not the best at communicating that. So for 13 years, she was at the New York Times leading and covering cybersecurity incidents. A lot of great articles she was involved in. And then for 4 years, I had the pleasure of working with her. We both served together at the CISA Cybersecurity Advisory Council, advising the director of CISA, back then Director Easterly. She left New York Times. She wrote her book. She's been doing this fantastic podcast that's charting the rise of the cybersecurity sort of dominance of China, called To Catch a Thief. And so if you're not subscribed or you don't listen to her podcast, you should definitely give it a listen, because again, it's an outsider perspective, but meticulous and fascinating. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Nicole. I'm really interested on her perspectives on this moment and what's going on. So let's give a round of applause for Nicole.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you to the Steves and all of the organizers at Black Hat. It is an honor to be here this morning. I was hoping a lot of you would be too hungover to actually attend this morning's event. I have dreaded this. I actually have been doing a lot of public speaking since I left the New York Times 4 years ago. But I was dreading this for one very specific reason, which is that I was in the audience of the Black Hat keynote 13 years ago, 2013, 12 years ago. And we were at Caesars, but I was in the 4th row, right about where you are. And the guys in the row in front of me were acting really sketchy. And I didn't know what was happening, but that year the keynote speaker was Keith Alexander, who was then the director of the NSA. Maybe some of you know this story. But I had come here from New York. For those of you who read my book, you know I was stuck in a storage closet at New York Times headquarters, going through some of the Snowden leaks. And I was told to work out of this windowless room at New York Times headquarters without a phone or a computer or internet, without any context, and to tell no one what I was working on. And the only day I was granted reprieve to leave was to come be here at Black Hat and to hear Keith Alexander speak. So I was sitting in the 4th row, and these guys were up to something. And all of a sudden, right before the director came out to speak, security swarmed in and confiscated their eggs, their egg carton. They were apparently planning to throw eggs at the director of the NSA. But Jeff told me just before I came on that they consulted with lawyers who said as long as they didn't actually hit him, they would be okay. And so that is the image I have had seared in my head ever since Jeff asked if I would consider doing this. Me standing here, you pelting me with eggs. So let's just get it over with. Here I am, so if you're still upset that I hyphenated the word 0 day in my book, or that I said Stuxnet had 7 vulnerabilities instead of just the 4 Windows 0 days, or if I somehow offended you on Twitter, I'm here. I don't know if I'm worth the cost of your eggs, but you can do what you need to do. Thank you. All right, let's begin. I had to get that over with. So I think that there are 2 people in this industry. There are people who choose cybersecurity, who have been tinkerers since birth, who see a system and all they're thinking about is how can I break that system? How can I use it for some other purpose? And I am actually not one of those people. Cybersecurity chose me, and I'm so grateful it did. I was working in a pretty peaceful, lovely, cush job at Forbes magazine when I got a call from the New York Times that they were looking at me for a job, and they didn't know if I'd want the job. And I said, "You're the New York Times, how bad could it be?" And they said, "It's cybersecurity." And I remember just kind of like trying not to let out this audible groan. I had gone out of my way not to know anything about cybersecurity. I thought it was highly technical and very intimidating. And I also just thought there were a lot of wonderful people who were already covering cybersecurity quite well. And the New York Times, one of the editors told me that the reason they were looking at me was because I had done a story for Forbes during the subprime mortgage crisis. I think we were all trying to make sense of the mess, how we got there. And I was too. And I was reading every story on the front page of the papers every day, and I still couldn't wrap my head around it. And I had read a book that's a great book called The Travels of a T-shirt in the Global Economy that followed one Walmart T-shirt, and it went back to the cotton farm in Texas where the cotton was grown, and it went to the factories in China where it was manufactured, and it traveled this T-shirt all around the world to the secondhand shops in Africa where it was resold. And I thought, I want to do that with a subprime mortgage. So I had found someone whose home was in foreclosure on Staten Island. She was a Liberian refugee, and she told me the story. She had tried to get a rental, and the broker hadn't showed her any rentals, but he had showed her 2 homes for sale. She made something like $30,000 a year off 2 part-time jobs, but somehow she was able to get a loan from Countrywide for this $300,000 home. And then I followed that loan as it was sliced and diced by Lehman Brothers and sold and pooled and tranched and rated and made its way through hedge funds and pension funds, all the way to AIG, and then us, the American taxpayer, who were left holding the bag. And someone at the New York Times had read that story, and they said, this person's good at explaining insanely complex topics to lay people. I think we should look at her for cybersecurity. And so, from my perspective, I didn't know any of this, but I got to the interviews, and I thought, this is going to be a disaster if they hire me to cover cybersecurity. But I'll do the interviews, and I'll be able to tell my grandkids that I was invited in one day. So I went to the interviews, and every time I had a great conversation with all the reporters and editors, and at the end I would always say, by the way, you shouldn't hire me, you should hire these other people. They're doing a great job covering cybersecurity. And the second day, someone stopped me, and they said, Nicole, I don't know if anyone's told you this yet. Apparently, we've all heard about your little short list you brought here, but we've interviewed all those people. We couldn't actually figure out what they were saying, so you're hired. And I was there for a decade. I like to say I walked in right after Stuxnet, and I walked out right after SolarWinds. And what I ended up covering over that decade was actually not that unlike that subprime mortgage story I did. I had learned during that story that there was a saying, a rolling loan carries no loss. And that dynamic was really true too in tech, where people were just getting the code to market, moving fast and breaking things, letting other people worry about the risk. And at the end of the day, when we would have these high-profile incidents, it was us, the American taxpayer in many cases, holding the bag. And that was a really unique lens, I think, to look at this space. But the other thing that happened not long after I joined the Times was we were hacked by a Chinese APT, Unit 61398 in Shanghai. And that was really what I call my Harvard Business School education in cybersecurity. And I just could not believe that businesses, journalists, were now expected to defend themselves from advanced nation-state hackers. And that is what I ended up covering over those 10 years at the New York Times. I think we could safely call it a decade of firsts. It was the first time, not just the New York Times, but businesses like Google stood up and publicly announced that they had been hacked by China. It was the first time we saw attacks that leveraged trusted software updates. It was the first time we saw a major attack through an HVAC system, through a smart fish tank, through a Chinese PDF takeout menu. It was a decade that ushered in a new era where cyber weapons weren't just used to spy, but to steal intellectual property and credit card details, but they were used to sabotage the physical world. And it was a decade where the targets expanded from a nuclear enrichment plant to the world's largest oil company, to Ukraine's elections, and then our own, and Ukraine's power grid, and now our own. It was a decade that our adversaries started coming for public discourse, our cyber weapons, and now our lifelines, pipelines, but also the healthcare system, transportation, aviation, power. The one that always stops me is water. And every time I would cover these attacks, there was great surprise. They often made the front page of the New York Times. But then we would just move on. We treated these as edge cases or anomalies or black swans. And we might cover it through a few news cycles for a couple weeks or maybe even a couple months. But then we would resume business as usual, and we'd all go back to it. And we didn't just move on, we would expand the attack surface. Now, to be fair to everyone in this room and to myself, it was impossible to do much more than just run from fire to fire over that decade. It still is, and the fires are just picking up in frequency. After a few too many Christmases ruined by Stratfor and Target, and then Sony, the DDoS attacks by Iran on American banks, I started telling my husband to just count me out from Christmas altogether. And if an incident was unfolding, I developed this really weird, uncanny, zombie-like ability to just stop whatever I was doing, pull out my computer, call one of you, usually John Holtquist or Jeff or there were a lot of you who helped me over that decade, and I would often just yell, "Help." And I just did what needed to be done to get things done by deadline, and we all did. And every couple of years, I'd write this middle-of-the-night Jerry Maguire memo to the masthead at the New York Times, and I'd say, we really need 12 people to cover cybersecurity. We need someone to cover Chinese industrial espionage all day. We need someone on ransomware. We need someone on these cryptocurrency exchange heists we're seeing. We need someone just to cover open source. We need someone to cover Five Eyes. We need someone to cover the point-of-sale hacks. But these requests were always denied, and it was always just me. And if I hadn't been getting my face dunked in breaches every single day, I might have seen the through line. And the through line was this. The attacks were getting worse. They were escalating. They were metastasizing in ways that we always underestimated. They were coming for our infrastructure and our discourse and our psyche, and the barrier to entry was dropping fast. Every attack, in retrospect, was just this slight twist, this slight advancement, this slight innovation on the high-profile attack that had come before it. Stuxnet was in a league of its own, but you have to remember it was part of this much broader espionage sabotage operation known internally as Olympic Games. And bits and pieces of that operation dribbled out in those first years I was covering cyber at the New York Times. And they had a way of coming back to bite us. There was the wiper attack on Iran's oil ministry that paralyzed crude oil exports and traffic at their Karg Island terminal. And then just a few months later, we saw that same capability in a much cruder form hit Saudi Aramco in the Shamoon attack, only it didn't just brick 30,000 computers, it replaced it all with an image I will never forget of a burning American flag. Then came Sony, where hackers didn't just torch Sony's servers and reduce them to pen and paper, they added the twist of the hack and leak campaign. And it was successful. They got executives fired. They kept the interview out of theaters. And while everyone did their back and forth on the attribution, was it North Korea, was it not? I think we missed what it really was, which was an assault on the First Amendment. We have not seen a fictionalized account of Kim Jong-un's assassination in Hollywood since. It was a preview of how easily attribution can be twisted and even weaponized to distract us from the real goals of the campaign and those behind it. And next came the hack of the DNC, or was it the 300-pound hacker in the basement? And this time they didn't just hack and leak Hillary Clinton's emails, they amplified them and they weaponized them. They even found a way to weaponize John Podesta's risotto recipe. And later we saw those same dynamics kind of filter down to ransomware, where first we saw ransomware on individual PCs, then we saw them on enterprises, then they didn't just wipe data, but they leaked it out if you didn't pay, and then they came for the supply chains, the Kaseyas, but also the hardware suppliers like Quanta, and started leaking out Apple's crown jewels, its product schematics, when nobody paid. And then they started coming for the supply chain of our infrastructure, Colonial Pipeline and United Healthcare. And these attacks with these third, fourth, fifth order effects that became our new norm. And we always seem to underestimate the human toll. And I really think that one of the greatest privileges of the job that I had at the New York Times was that I had a front row seat to the human toll. When there was a ransomware attack at University of Vermont Medical Center, I'll never forget talking to the nurses, and they said, why aren't there news vans everywhere? How do people not understand what's happening? We can't give our chemo patients their chemo. We can't give them their cancer treatments. We can't tell them if their tumor has grown. We're turning away patients. We're canceling procedures. And one nurse told me that the only thing she could compare the triage to and the trauma of it was working the burn unit after the Boston Marathon bombing. Some of us remember the 78-year-old woman who died in transit to the hospital in Germany after she had an aortic aneurysm, and she was turned away by the nearest hospital because of a ransomware attack and ultimately died, they think, due to the medical delays. And they were never able to make the case, lawyers, that there was direct causation there. But I thought of her when my 80-year-old father had an aortic dissection and survived because he was able to get to the hospital on time and get the surgery he needed. The human toll always seemed to get worse and worse. And everything in this space just had a way of metastasizing. Everything trickled down. Flame. I'll never forget talking to the Microsoft executives who learned on Memorial Day weekend that the Microsoft certificate trust chain had been exploited in that attack. And later we would see some of those same techniques, only in a slightly cruder or less sophisticated form, less targeted form, far less targeted form, show up in NotPetya with the Russian attack of the MEDOC accounting software, and later in SolarWinds. And these weren't black swans. They were warning shots. And the fact that they worked spectacularly in some cases only emboldened our adversaries and cyber criminals. What we dismissed as these edge cases were just early indicators of what was going to come. The shift from targeted espionage to broad sabotage, from isolated incidents to systemic disruption. We saw nation-state TTPs like spyware and other espionage capabilities, coordinated influence campaigns, become tools for intimidation. Spyware that was really once the purview of these tier 1, tier 2 nation-states made their way to governments with no cyber talent to speak of, but deep pockets. Hacking Team, FinFisher, NSO Group. I am sad to say I missed Ron's speech yesterday, but it was an honor to work with him over those decades at the New York Times when someone would call me and they'd say, hey, I think I might have some spyware on my device. And Bill Marczak or JSR or Ron Diebert would help me confirm as much. And we started finding the spyware on not the phones of terrorists or criminals, but civil rights activists like Ahmed Mansour in the UAE, whose only real crime was to go on Twitter and ask for more voting rights. And we called him the $1 million dissident because we found the trifecta of spyware on his devices. And he told me, Nicole, one day you'll find yourself a terrorist, labeled a terrorist, even though you don't know how to put a bullet inside a gun. And he's been serving 15 years prison sentence ever since, most of it in solitary confinement. I haven't spoken to him since he said those words to me. I also started catching NSO spyware and Pegasus on the phones of Mexican journalists. Their children, in some cases. And these weren't stealth campaigns. They got pretty brazen. They would get these phishing lures sent to them over SMS, usually saying your child's in danger or hey, you're in the news. And they would click on the link, and in every case, it would send them to Galloso, the Mexican funeral services site. The goal was really to intimidate them from doing brave work. And again, we continue to treat these as edge cases, but these intimidation tactics, this use of families, of children, has just metastasized in new and really disturbing ways. I live out in Silicon Valley, grew up there, and at Stanford University, there was an article, an investigation in the Stanford Review. And they determined that Chinese PhD students working in Stanford's AI labs had been quietly coerced and threatened with harm to their families back in China if they didn't provide regular updates into the research into frontier technologies like AI. Their work is being watched, and so are they. And the goal, it appears, is to help China evade export controls and get an advanced look at breakthrough technology. The Stanford Review found, in interviewing a lot of these Chinese PhD students who I think pretty bravely granted them anonymous interviews, that they'd been put through loyalty tests and police visits, and they'd been steered towards sensitive research areas, and then required by Chinese intelligence laws to provide regular updates. And what these journalists concluded was a, quote, full stack approach to information collection. And it feels so strange to even call that dynamic out. It feels xenophobic. It's so unnatural to us. But I think the point is that this is insider risk in a new coerced form, and we're just not set up for it. Our universities were built for openness, for collaboration, for students regardless of nationality. It's what makes our universities so competitive. It's a critical US national asset, and it's what makes us also so uniquely vulnerable to these campaigns. Our adversaries have found ways to exploit the very nature of our democracy, of free markets, of our civil liberties, of our public discourse. Disinformation campaigns have become tools for intimidation, not just against political candidates or in elections, but against government leaders and businesses. And here I want to tell you a little story. So I spoke at a conference in 2022. It was a private conference of some of the CEOs of the world's largest businesses. And that year I spoke on ransomware. And afterwards I took a shuttle to dinner, and the guy in the shuttle with me happened to be the then CEO of Rio Tinto. And he said, Nicole, I sat through your talk, and I get it. We have a blank check for ransomware. We have all the bells and whistles. I think we're prepared for even a $50 million ransomware attack. I want to talk to you about disinformation. And he told me this story that they had a mine project in Serbia. It was a lithium mine. And yes, there were the usual environmental concerns. But in this case, the lithium was going to be used for EV batteries, for clean energy. I think they were projected to have an output of 1 million new EV batteries a year over 40 years. So for the most part, stakeholders were usually on board with this. And all that was left to do, he told me, was to do the televised ribbon-cutting ceremony with the Serbian prime minister. And so they do the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and immediately they get inundated with Russian bots and trolls. And there are all of these conspiracy theories about the mine project not really being for lithium, but being for uranium, that it was going to rain down sulfuric acid on Belgrade. And those were just the PG conspiracy theories he shared. A lot of them were personal, toxic, about the CEO himself, about Serbia's first female prime minister. And he said there was no playbook. I went to my comms team and I asked them, what do we do? What do we say? And they said, say nothing. Don't give this oxygen. It's so ludicrous, it will go away. Well, it didn't go away. There were tens of thousands of Serbians poured into the street to protest. Anti-mine banners started showing up at their soccer games. And it got so bad that the Serbian prime minister called him and said, I'm sorry, I am up for re-election this fall. This mine project is toxic. I'm shutting it down. And he said, Nicole, I was prepared for a $50 million ransomware attack. I was not prepared for a $2.4 billion disinformation attack. And when I asked him, why did Russia go through the effort? Why did they have this coordinated campaign against a mine project? He said it was complicated, and this history of Serbia and Russia is complicated, but he said he was told that this was Putin's way of holding a gun to their head and saying, I can take away anything precious to you at any time of our choosing. That story and the backstory of Russian involvement was barely a one-day news clip. The Wall Street Journal covered it, but no one else really covered it. There were no follow-up stories. We moved on. Most people never heard about it. I didn't know about it until he told me. Even as these narrative attacks started showing up with unnerving frequency. And now they're here. It's domestic. We are seeing people choose silence rather than face narrative attacks, not by nation-state groups, but by special interest groups. And they're largely being successful at keeping politicians and businesses and their employees in line. I saw this firsthand at RSA this year. People I was supposed to be moderating panels with were suddenly pulled from the panels because their employer was too scared they would be asked about Chris Krebs, and that they might say something that would have their federal contracts pulled or lead to death threats or worse. We're watching colleagues at the highest levels of public service in cyber have their jobs taken away, their academic appointments rescinded because they did their jobs. And I'm seeing these, I'm watching these, and then I'm watching that most of these incidents are being met with silence and a shrug. And what I want to say about that is it's not okay. You know, we don't judge institutions by how they bring people in. We judge them by how they treat people on the way out. And in case you didn't know, we have an acute cyber workforce shortage in this country. 500,000 unfilled jobs by some estimates. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the workforce shortage in my role on CISA's advisory committee with Jeff. I served on the CISA subcommittee on workforce. And I thought about a lot of the ways we could bring our best and brightest into government, into CISA, into cyber defense. I had this dream of setting up this cyber rotation where people would come in for 6-month tours of duty, spin out, and then we would designate them cyber liaisons that we could call upon when we would have these heightened geopolitical crises like we did with Ukraine. And lately I've been losing a lot of sleep because I keep thinking that when we see these dismissals and these incidents, I keep thinking, what does it say to our future generation of cyber warriors when the people who are in the highest level of public service aren't just getting summarily dismissed, but there's a targeted effort to make them unemployable, to have their TSA global entry taken away because they did their job, securing our elections. And what does it say when the rest of us are silent? I worry about this a lot. And when you look at it through this lens, you start to see it as a national security threat. Because we've come a long way in these last 12 years since someone was planning to throw eggs at General Alexander up here. We have built up an incredible public-private partnership that I had the privilege to see with my own two eyes at CISA when Russia invaded Ukraine. We built up a partnership that was critical in stemming off the worst of those initial attacks. And I think most of the people in our industry know what happened, but a lot of people outside our industry still have this perception, this dangerous misdiagnosis that there was no cyber in Ukraine, when in fact, we saw unbelievable levels of aggression. We saw the hack of Viasat, and then we saw Starlink come in and keep Ukraine's military comms alive. We saw those initial unprecedented waves of DDoS attacks on Ukraine government agencies and on banks. And then in came Cloudflare and Google and Amazon to stem the tide of those attacks. We did find malware in those Ukrainian power stations, but CISA and Ukraine's Cyber Defense Agency and ESET were able to work together to root it out before it even detonated. And perhaps most unbelievably of all, we worked together, public and private entities, to unearth Pipe Dream, this Swiss Army knife of critical infrastructure hacking tools, before it even reached the wild. We caught it in deployment. And I don't think that we study this enough. More recently, I've been focused on the Chinese threat against our critical infrastructure. And for those of you who listen to my podcast, I hope you just listen to this one episode where I interview Nick Lawler, who is the general manager of Littleton Electric Light and Water in Littleton, Massachusetts. Nick oversees utilities, water, for a population of about 15,000 in a pretty rural stretch of the state. And one day he gets a call from CISA and the FBI, and they say, we need you to click on this link because we think you might have been impacted or breached in this compromise. And he's like, sure, I'm going to click on your link, and he hangs up. And then he Googles the names of these guys, and he Googles the local FBI field office, and he realizes it's a real person. He reaches them. He said, if you're serious about this, show up Monday morning at 10 a.m. So these guys show up, and lo and behold, it's someone from the FBI and someone from CISA, maybe you're even here in this audience. And they tell him he's been compromised by Volt Typhoon, which is one of these ridiculous code names for a Chinese PLA actor that has been embedding in our critical infrastructure. And together, they were able to root Volt Typhoon out of Littleton's systems. That is so far from where we have been. We need these levels of public-private collaboration. We need that trust that we can work together to root out these attacks. Attacks that once came at us from these servers in Shanghai or St. Petersburg are now being orchestrated from servers in New Jersey or home routers in Indianapolis in one case, precisely where our intelligence agencies can't look. We're seeing Chinese APTs infiltrate these American home routers through all the usual ways that everyone in this room knows about: default settings, passwords, misconfigurations, legacy issues. And then we're seeing them turn them into botnets, and then we're seeing them use those botnets on our most critical infrastructure in these living off the land attacks that we are picking up with a disturbing frequency. These are hybrid attacks that are clearly designed to pre-position themselves for the event they might need to do some damage one day. I don't know if that's inevitable. At CISA, we talk about the everything, everywhere, all at once cyber attack scenario. And you read back this 1999 PLA doctrine called unrestricted warfare that was written by these two PLA colonels. And in it, they really map out a strategy where they basically say that by doing things like hacking America's critical infrastructure and turning it off in some cases, they can really diminish America's political appetite to go to war. They can win a war without firing a single bullet, is the idea. And right now, we're seeing them infiltrate our most critical infrastructure. And I don't know if it's going to be the everything, everywhere, all at once cyber attack scenario. The thinking is that if Xi really wants to reunify with Taiwan, that he would do this to maybe delay military mobilization or create chaos and panic and ultimately diminish our willingness to support an island 7,000 miles away. And I don't know if it's inevitable, but it's clear that they're keeping their options open. And all I know is that the only way out of this is if we preserve this really fragile trust between the public and private entities. Because Americans couldn't live without TikTok for one day. Think about what our willingness will be to support Taiwan when we can't even get water for a day or a week, or worse, the water is contaminated. I think we all know the answer, and I think the CCP does too. We ignore these attacks at our own peril. They're not anomalies, they're signals. And they're picking up in innovation and in frequency. China passed new national security laws that force Chinese citizens to turn over 0 days to the state, to give the state right of first refusal. And now every year we see a new banner year for 0 days. Some of the most serious are coming from China, like the ones we recently saw with the Microsoft SharePoint issue that was used on 400 plus targets, among them the US Nuclear Security Administration. And we're seeing China federate access the same way ransomware as a service does, where they're finding 0 days, they're scanning for everyone vulnerable, they're brokering that access, they're using this hacker for hire strategy. And it's picking up in terms of infiltrations and frequency. And by all accounts, what we are seeing, what we are catching, is only the tip of the iceberg. And now, here we are, standing on what might be the greatest precipice of our lifetime with AI. We know they're in our systems already. We know they're in our infrastructure. We know they're in our power. We know they're in our communications. We know they're in our narratives. And it's not just China. But now they're being trained. These threats are being automated. They're being deployed at scale. And the question now isn't whether we can stop them. I think the question is, do we even have the courage to try? We've been in this honeymoon with AI. We are unlocking amazing levels of efficiency. This thing is going to completely change the way we do medical diagnostics. It's going to free us up to think about higher order tasks. But I suspect that next year's Black Hat is going to look very different than this year's. And I think in this question of whether AI will favor defense or offense, early signs suggest that offense is going to have the advantage. Microsoft Copilot was broken in June, GitHub Copilot, the Echo leak exploitation. We're now seeing hackers target agentic workflows. Claude is winning hacking competitions. Expo's topping the HackerOne leaderboards. Those are just the platforms that we hear about in public. And I think despite this promise that maybe we'll actually be able to use AI to generate more secure code, to configure things securely, to finally figure out how to do automated patching and get us out of this technical debt, There was a report last week from Veracode that suggested it could go the other way, that these LLMs, in fact, perform very poorly at generating secure code. And we're getting further and further from the machines at the moment that we are giving them more and more power. I think frequently about Ken Thompson's 1983 warning, Reflections on Trusting Trust, when he warned that you cannot trust code that you didn't write yourself. And now we're going to be trusting vibe coding. We're losing a depth of understanding, and we're going to have to expend every effort imaginable to find our way out, to outwit machines with machines. We're already seeing companies make million-dollar wire payments because of an audio deepfake. We're seeing North Korean remote workers take advantage of deepfake technologies in interviews. We're seeing ransomware groups use AI to federate initial access, to test every vulnerability, test for every CVE. They're training these models to find business-critical data assets to paralyze. And they're leveraging AI chatbots and training them to handle negotiations and apply maximum psychological pressure. They're automating the whole kill chain. And as AI pushes into every system, not just at the application level, but the knowledge layer, we are building mission-critical operations atop unpredictable models that can be manipulated and hijacked and poisoned at scale. Executives are putting out press releases saying that their workforce is AI ready, but the truth is we do have a window here. We are not seeing widespread enterprise-scale orchestration, not yet. There was a McKinsey, their latest global survey found that nearly 75% of companies say they've adopted some form of AI, but only a quarter of those have moved beyond a pilot project. We can still steer this thing. We have a narrow window, but it's closing fast. And once AI becomes embedded, once it's baked into our infrastructure, into our decision-making, into defense, the cost of failure only multiplies. And I worry, unlike some of the supply chain attacks we've seen to date, like SolarWinds, it will become irreversible. Secure by design has never been more urgent. And it is incumbent on each of us to find our voice in this moment, to treat these incidents for what they are. They are not edge cases, they are previews of what will come if we don't get this right. The fundamentals of security, the things we've been talking about for years, are now urgent. We can't be no people. We can't say, no, you can't use this, you'll lose your job. I don't recommend that. But we have to find ways to be articulate about the need to use guardrails, secure by design, to secure the models, not just when they're going into deployment, but from their infancy. We need to shift left. We need to secure the unstructured raw data itself before it makes its way to these models. And we need to deploy red teams like we never have before. I am encouraged by two things. One, the innovation I am seeing. After I left journalism to help CISA and serve on the advisory committee, I started advising young startups, and I set up what I call my Cyber Moonshot Fund. And now I'm a venture partner at Ballistic Ventures. And I am seeing innovation that gives me great hope. I'm seeing real-time deepfake detection technologies. I'm seeing solutions that catch ransomware attackers when they get in, create AI-induced hallucinations to entrap them, while they move critical data to other systems and lock everything down. I'm seeing agents that can do what we've never been able to do ourselves as humans, which is interrogate third-party risk 24/7. I'm seeing end-to-end AI security solutions come to market. And I'm seeing AI used to help democratize security for small and medium enterprises that just have not had the manpower to do it themselves. The second thing that has always given me great hope, and the reason I am still in cybersecurity, I really thought I was only going to be here for 2 years and then go back to covering venture capital or something. But I stuck with it, and it's because of you. Because in this industry, we self-select for courage. Courage abounds. Think of Dan Kaminsky and DNS. Google coming forth and announcing that China had hacked them, knowing they would get cut out of the world's fastest growing market. Marcus Hutchins sinkholing WannaCry. Chris Krebs saying this is the most secure election in history. The Alibaba employee who disclosed the Log4j vulnerability when his employer and he would face great consequence. Kevin Mandia handing me the APT1 report after we were hacked at the New York Times. And later, Kevin Mandia disclosing his own breach at Mandiant when he didn't have to, because there was no PII there. And that disclosure helped us identify the root cause, which was SolarWinds. And all of the people the organizations that stood up cyber defense in Ukraine. Joe Marshall, who mounted an incredible pro bono effort, said something on stage when he was awarded the Community Builder Award at S4 a couple years ago. And I want to repeat it here today. He said, "We're not in the cybersecurity business anymore. We are in the saving civilization business." There are times I want to opt out of this whole thing. But unfortunately, I have a 7-year-old and I have a daughter that was born within a month of the public launch of ChatGPT. And I have no choice but to leave it all out on the field here. There are times I want to prep. I want to find my way off the grid. And I'm going to leave you here with one story. This summer, a month ago, I went to the Dolomites with my husband. It was a dream I've always had to do these via ferratas, where you rock climb up these cliff faces and you hike hut to hut. We were going to be off the grid, and we were going to do it for our 10th anniversary. So we go out there, and we do these incredible via ferratas. It's amazing. And on day 3, I'm at this hut, and I slam my foot, and I can feel my toe break, and my foot swells up. And there's no way out of this hut but to hike 7 miles up and over this crazy mountain, up these scree fields, and down. And so the next day, we set out, and I'm walking so slowly, and everything's okay. And then we get to the top of this field, and there's a lightning storm. And our mountain guide is yelling at me, "Run. Run." And I'm trying to run on my foot, and I am crying, and I'm saying things like, "I just want to see my kids again." And it gets so bad, the pain gets so bad, I finally say, "I don't know if I can do this. I think we need to call in rescue." And so he radios in for rescue, and there's just silence. And he radios in again, and there's just silence. Turns out the South Tyrol Alpine Rescue System had been hit with a ransomware attack. And I'm just sitting there on the face of this mountain, looking up at this lightning and feeling so viscerally what I've been writing about for years, which is this: there's no offline anymore. You can prep all you want, but at some point you're going to need some help. And all of that help at these hospitals, in these alpine rescue systems, your 9/11 operator, they're all digitized. And so if I leave you with one message, it's this: the only way out is through. And the only way through is with courage. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I have a couple of closing notes. The briefing sessions start at 10:20. The business hall is open. We have an afternoon main stage talk starting at 12:15 in Oceanside A. We have the Startup Spotlight competition beginning this afternoon at 1:30, Oceanside D. And finally, tonight, this evening, we're having our lock note session. I'll be moderating a panel of review board members at 4:20 this evening on level 2 in Oceanside A. So I'll see you there when we shut this all down. So thank you very much. Have a great day.